Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Constitution, and we're not going to spend too much time on what's in the Constitution and that sort of thing. That's really more for civics. So we're just going to do the quick version or the nutshell version of the Constitution. So what are the things you absolutely need to know about the Constitution in order to be in this class? So let's go ahead and begin. So first of all, you should know that there is a government that is set up in our country before the Constitution. You should all already know what that is. It is, of course, the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation were put into place in 1781, just after the end of the American Revolution. And this kind of government is very much founded on the Revolution. The things that are in the Articles of Confederation are things that are in there because of the issues of the Revolution, and we'll see kind of what they are in just a second. So some of the accomplishments, let's start with the good things that the article did. Right after the American Revolution, the Articles of Confederation, the government under the Articles of Confederation, realizes that there's some new land that we've got that we need to kind of figure out what's going on. So they pass the first one in 1785, the Land Ordinance of 1785, where basically they send out people into the frontier to kind of survey what the frontier looks like, what kind of territory is there, what kind of Native American groups are living there. The second thing that they do is they go and they divide that territory in 1787 with the Northwest Ordinance. So they kind of divide it up into territories, which are going to become future states. So they divide it up into 5 separate territories. So if you look at this map over here, you can kind of see where they did that. You can see that over here is the Southwest Territory. Here's the Northwest Territory up here. So why is this important? What is the big deal about these land ordinances? And really the thing here is that this is going to really be the beginning of the future growth of our nation. As we grow and make more states and spread further across our country, this is really what starts it all. It really couldn't have happened without this. So that's a pretty big deal. However, there are a lot more issues with the Articles of Confederation than there are good things. So let's take a look at what those are. So the first one deals with Congress. So the Articles of Confederation sets up what's called a unicameral legislature, which means that Congress is only one house, and Congress can't collect taxes, and they can't regulate trade. Now, first of all, why would they have given Congress this idea? Let's think about that. What was the British king doing that pissed off the colonies so much that they ended up rebelling against them? They were passing taxes and regulating trade. That's what the American colonists did not like about what the king was doing. So when they're making their government, they're not going to give those powers to Congress. Who do you think is going to have those powers instead? The states, right? So the states are the only ones that can collect taxes or tariffs or regulate trade. That's going to become a problem because that means that the states are regulating trade within each other, so the rules of trading in North Carolina might be different than the rules of trading in South Carolina. Or the taxes on imports in Virginia might be higher than the taxes on imports in Georgia. So it's going to be a pretty big problem. The other thing that is a problem is the states only had one vote. This meant that states with larger populations and states with smaller populations were equal, which seems okay, except that means like a state with only like 2 people in it could influence an entire law, right? So that's going to be an issue for a lot of people. The second thing that is the problem with the Articles is that there's no executive branch, so no president, no king, no nothing. And again, why might they not have one chief executive? They don't want to copy a king, right? They also don't establish a court system, a federal court system. Again, that's an issue going back to the American Revolution. They don't want the federal government to have that much power, right? The next thing they do is that they really don't have any kind of unity between the different states because different states are able to kind of be their own little individual country rather than all being united states in one country. So all the states are kind of making up their own minds about things, doing their things their own way. There's no really like federal government that links them all together. And finally, the last thing that we have here is that you can only change or amend the Articles of Confederation if all states agree on it. You have to have 13 out of 13 votes. If 13 people have ever tried to agree on one thing, you know that's hard, right? And think about as our country starts to grow, we have 50 states now. Can you get 50 states to all agree on one thing? That's really hard to do. So they can't even change it without getting all states to agree to change it. And guess what? They can't even do that, right? So there's a lot of issues with the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, who has more power? The national government or the state governments, okay? Think about this. Which one? Who can do the most, the states or the federal government? The states, right? So write that down. You need to know the states have more power than the federal government. So enter Daniel Shays, right? So we looked a little bit at Daniel Shays already. And what he did, what? Well, Daniel Shays was upset because there is heavy debt on farmers that are being taxed up in Massachusetts. So farmers are pretty much always in debt anyway, and they are now getting these additional taxes put on them by the state of Massachusetts, and they're really upset about this. So Daniel Shays gets a group of farmers together, and they march to Springfield, Massachusetts, where the courts of Massachusetts are being held. And they rebel against the courts there and start fighting against what's going on there. This is just a few years after the American Revolution, right? Like, they're already showing a lot of unrest in what's going on, and most of these guys were Revolutionary War veterans, right? So eventually, after 4 are killed in this revolution, which may not seem like a lot, but it's similar to the Boston Massacre, eventually it does fail. But what is this saying about the strength of the government, especially the federal government? They're not able to raise an army. They're not able to send men in to put it down. So it's saying that the federal government is strong or weak. It's pretty weak, right? The federal government needs to be stronger. They need to be able to put down rebellions if they take place in their own country. Massachusetts, the only way they could get help is asking the other states to send militias, and the other states weren't willing to do that. So the federal government basically is like, we need to be able to send an army or a militia into a state and subdue a rebellion if it needs to happen. So because of this, the leaders of the country decide they want to get together and amend the Articles of Confederation, just change it, right? So some of the big names, there are a lot of delegates that are coming there, but the ones that you need to make sure you know are James Madison. He is sometimes called the father of the Constitution. He did a lot of the writing of it himself, so that's a really big deal. Alexander Hamilton, he was a delegate from New York City, and he is a very strong Federalist, and we'll talk about what that means in a bit. George Washington presides as the president of the Constitutional Convention. And then Ben Franklin is there. He is the oldest member in the convention. He's in his 80s at this point. He actually dies not long after the Constitutional Convention. So this is kind of his last big hurrah. And he has a lot of influence in what's going to happen with the Constitution. So as I said, the idea here is to strengthen the federal government. The federal government is so weak, it just can't do anything. It needs to be able to tax. It needs to be able to regulate trade. It needs to be able to raise an army. So the idea here is we're going to make it stronger. Where? They meet in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is the capital of the country at the time. When they're meeting, this is important, in the summer of 1787. If you've ever been to Pennsylvania in the summer, you know it is hot and muggy, right? But here's the thing. They didn't want anybody to know what they were doing. That's the rule, is don't tell anyone what we're doing, right? Keep it quiet. Because if people know that we're trying to change the government, they might get really mad and rebel. We want to make sure we have the perfect document before we start handing this out to people and letting them know what we're doing. So they were in this room, the same room that the Declaration of Independence was voted on, and it's summer, it's hot, they're in wool and wigs, right? And they keep the windows shut, right? There's no circulation of air, there's no nothing. Heat is high, tensions are high. It's really kind of a miracle they were able to knock this out in just a few months. That's a really big deal. So let's look at what was decided on in the Constitutional Convention. Of course, as I said, you've got 13 different states. They're all wanting different things, so we have to compromise. The beauty of the Constitution is its compromises. So they have to come together and figure out how we're going to figure a lot of these issues. So the first is a compromise over voting. Who gets to have a say in the federal government's Congress? Smaller states want one vote, like in the Articles. Larger states want to vote based on population because they're going to have more votes, right? The larger the population, the more votes you have. So it makes sense that larger states want a higher population. The idea is that it's more equal that way, right? Well, they can't agree, so they come up with what's called the Great Compromise. This has come up by Roger Sherman. You might want to write his name down. Roger Sherman proposes a two-house legislature. So instead of just one house, we have two. The House of Representatives is based on a representative population of each state. So if you have a state with 100 million people, your number of representatives in Congress is going to be higher than a state with 1,000 people, right? Then the other house is the Senate, and the Senate has equal representation, 2 senators from every state. So today in our country, we have how many senators? 100, right? And then in the House of Representatives, we have 432 representative members. So that's the Great Compromise. The next compromise is getting to figure out, okay, now that we know we're doing this based on population, how are we going to count our population? So the South decides that they want to count population, including their slaves, right? So think about why they might want to do this. In states in the South, if you include slaves in your population, you're going to have a much higher population. The population is lower in the South anyway, so they want to kind of increase their numbers. Whereas in the North, they do not want slaves to count as part of the population. The idea being that slaves are property and they don't get to vote. So why would we count them in the population? So they come up with what we call the 3/5 compromise. So this means that 3/5 of a state's slaves will be counted in voting. So what that means is if you're a slave owner, right, and you have 5 slaves, 3 of your slaves count for the population of your state, okay? Another way to think of this is that for every 1 slave, 3/5 of that person counts, right? But basically, it's, again, 3/5 of a state's slaves are going to be counted in voting. It's not a very fair compromise because, again, slaves don't get to vote, but they are counted as part of the population, right? The next thing that they have is a compromise over the slave trade. So a lot of states in the North want to abolish or get rid of the slave trade altogether. Not get rid of slavery, not abolish slavery, just the importation of slaves into the country. Well, as you can imagine, a lot of southern states are not crazy about this idea because they're going to lose part of their workforce, right? So the compromise that they come up with is southern states are willing to say, we will allow Congress to regulate trade instead of the states regulating trade. However, for 20 years, they cannot touch the slave trade. It has to stay as it is. In 20 years, we'll come back and figure out if we want to get rid of the slave trade. They do get rid of it in 20 years. In 1807, I think is the year of that. I can't remember exactly. But that's how that compromise works out. The last one is the Electoral College. So they got to figure out how they're going to elect, specifically the president and the senators. So the Electoral College is a group of representatives from the state who vote for the president and senators, right? Today, they only choose the president, but this is something we still have today. Presidents are not, when you go and vote in a voting booth, you do not vote for president. You might choose who you want to be president, but you don't actually get to elect the president. That is done by the Electoral College. So why do you think these people would want to put in someone else voting instead of the direct voting? There's a couple reasons why this is put into place. First of all, they don't want political parties. There are no political parties at the time, so that's going to be one factor. There's also a limitation on travel and communication. You may not be able to get to a voting booth, right? And then maybe only a third of the population gets to vote. There's also a lot of division among the regions. This kind of plays back into that. But really, quite honestly, these rich white guys didn't really trust the poor white guys, right? They didn't trust the frontiersman or the common man who's not been educated to make the right choice in voting. Average people will not get to vote for president until 1828. And it's still, like I said, doesn't count. Now, the Electoral College is in theory supposed to choose who the popular presidential candidate is. So if like everybody in the state of North Carolina voted for Barack Obama, then our electoral college would vote for Barack Obama, and it's supposed to kind of play out that way. But it doesn't always work. Sometimes the popular vote and the electoral vote do not match. So those are kind of some of the key makeups of the Constitution. There are some kind of debates that go on because of this. The debaters are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So write this down. This is not on your slide, but write it down. Federalists are people who support the new Constitution. Anti-Federalists are people who do not support or are anti-Constitution, right? So there's a couple reasons why they are debating this. So the first is that this issue over debt and credit. So who gets to pay the debt, who gets to tax, right? Anti-Federalists kind of want to help out farmers and help make sure that they're able to pay. Think of like Daniel Shays and that sort of thing. Whereas Federalists want to kind of help the bankers, the people who are printing the money. They kind of see the people who control the money are the ones who have the most say. Next, we have the idea of strict versus loose construction. Anti-Federalists say that if it's not written in the Constitution, you can't do it. So if it doesn't say that the Constitution can regulate telephone communication, which it doesn't, the federal government shouldn't be allowed to do it. But think about this, right? In 1789, cell phones didn't exist, right? It'd be kind of hard for them to guess that. So here's what the Federalists say. There's some wiggle room, right? If it's not spelled out that you can't do it, then you will be able to kind of work it in, right? So it doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that the federal government can't regulate cell phones. So it's okay that they do. There's also something else missing in 1789 that's a pretty important part of the Constitution. Any guesses on what that might be, right? Well, it's the Bill of Rights. So all of those basic rights, like right to bear arms, right of assembly, freedom of the speech, freedom of press, all of those things are not in the Constitution quite yet in 1787 when it's written. That's going to be kind of a hinging point for this debate. A lot of anti-federalists will refuse to vote on the Constitution until that gets in there. And in 1789, they do put it in. So here's kind of some of the important underlying principles of the Constitution, those things that are still part of our government today. So the first is popular sovereignty, where the people are voting directly on the people who will represent them. This is specifically part of the House of Representatives at this time. So that is who they get to vote for. They don't vote for president, they don't vote for senators, but they do get to pick those House of Representatives members. And eventually this idea of popular sovereignty, or the people are sovereign, or the people rule, right? That's going to become more true in other parts of government as well. The second part is federalism. So we've thrown this word around a little bit already, but this is powers divided between the national government and the state government. So think about the Constitution, the way it's written. There are things that the federal government can do, and there are things that the state government can do. And the state governments can't infringe on those things that the federal government can do, but the federal government can't step on the rights of the states either. So this is just kind of a good way to balance out the government. And speaking of balancing out the government, one thing that we want to make sure is that no one branch of government becomes too powerful. So that's why we don't say, instead of just one guy making all the decisions, we have three branches of government. We have the executive branch, which is our president, who enforces our laws. We have the legislative branch, who makes our laws or legislates our laws. And then we have the judicial branch, who makes sure those laws are okay. They check those laws out, right? So we have three branches instead of just one doing everything. And part of separation of powers is also this idea of checks and balances. This is the idea that like this branch can check the power of this branch. So voting is a great way to think about this, where when a law is being passed, right? It has to first go through the House of Representatives and the Senate, so it goes through Congress first. Well, to make sure that that's a good law, the president reviews it and signs off on it. Or the president could decide to veto it, right? Like, screw you, Congress, that's not a good law, and sends it back to Congress. Well, Congress then could decide to override the presidential veto, right? So if they override the presidential veto, it's going to become a law anyway. But then the Supreme Court could come in and say that law is not constitutional and get rid of it. So this is kind of the idea here, is to make sure that one branch cannot overpower another branch, that all of the branches remain equal in power. We could argue about whether that's true or not, but that's really more civics, so we'll stay away from it. The other thing that's really great about the Constitution is that it's flexible. This is what we call a living document. It can be changed or amended. You can add to it or take away from it. And in a lot of ways, it's going to end up becoming the model for other constitutions around the world, particularly in France during their revolution in the 1780s and 90s. They based some of their principles on the American Constitution. So when you say a living document, it means that it can be changed, it can be added to, taken away from. It's never the same, right? It's a flexible document, which is why it's been our system of government for almost 300 years, right? Speaking of the fact that it's been our Constitution for so long, I have this pretty cool coin. You may have seen it in the back of my room, but it is the 200th anniversary coin of the Constitution. And I like it for a couple different reasons. First of all, the 200th anniversary is in September of 1987, which is the year I was born, so it's kind of special for me. I was born the year of the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. This is a pretty cool coin. If you see on the back of it, it says "We the People" on it. This is an idea in the preamble of the Constitution where we the people are the ones who control the government. That's this idea of popular sovereignty, right? And then on the front, it's got James Madison, our father of the Constitution. Also, it's got a guy named Gouverneur Morris. He kind of was another big player in the Constitutional Convention. But it's a pretty cool coin to represent the 200th anniversary. It's also got this really cool sun on the top of it. That might seem kind of a weird thing that's on here, but I'll explain that particular sun in just a minute. So, when the Constitution gets ratified, right, and what that means is passed or approved, there were at least 9 states that had to agree on it. So 9 of the 13 states had to agree on the Constitution. And those debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists got really heated up. The Federalists, like I said, favored the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists opposed it. It was not until they added or agreed to add a Bill of Rights that brings a lot of the Anti-Federalists into the Constitution. So remember that sun I just showed you, right? Where else on this page do you see that sun? On the bottom of that chair. So this was the chair that George Washington sat in as the president of the Constitutional Convention. And supposedly, after they approved the Constitution and signed it, Ben Franklin made this little quip, which he was really good at. But he said, I've been trying to figure out the whole time we've been here if that is a picture of a rising sun or a setting sun. I now know it's a rising sun, basically kind of implying that with this new Constitution, our nation is rising, right? We are becoming a new nation. The fact that we were able to write our own system of government from scratch, that's a really cool thing. So the Constitution is finally ratified in 1789. Eventually, all states will go on to ratify it. It took a while for every state to jump on board. Rhode Island, for example, was a little slow on the uptake, so was New York. But it was eventually ratified in 1789, and we now have our Constitution. So this is a pretty famous painting of the Constitution. You can see George Washington in his sun chair up there in the top corner. Ben Franklin is down here. Here's our James Madison right here. Some of the other delegates are in the Constitutional Convention as well. Those that are opposed it are actually not very prominent. You can see this guy's got kind of his back turned or whatever, whereas these guys are kind of praising it. But it's still a really important change in our country's history, and it's going to go on to be kind of the founding of our country. So we'll pick back up with this on Monday. I'll see you guys later.